哋咧而家夠人亦都夠鐘啦。
Members, we have formed a quorum, and it's time to get started. The information paper issued since the last meeting, they are listed on the agenda, so I won't name them one by one. And rent adjustment mechanism for rental units and rental relief measures of Hong Kong Housing Society. And the relevant papers are listed on the agenda. Please invite the guests to join in. And who would like to speak? Mr. Kwok Wai Kang. I've received a petition from Kun Long Lau. They ask whether we can have a public hearing after the council resumes in October. Okay, we'll deal with that later. And I would like to ask the Secretariat to distribute copies of the petition letter to members.
好，咁就我哋歡迎房協嘅代表。
I'd like to welcome representatives from the Housing Society. I won't introduce them one by one to save time. So first of all, I would like Mr. Wong Kit Leung from the Hong Kong Housing Society to give an introduction to the paper. Yes, I'm glad to come here as we have done in the past. At present, there are 20 rental estates under the Hong Kong Housing Society with a total of 32,600 units. We have two groups of units. Group A, like the Housing Authority, caters for low-income families, and Group B targets families of relatively higher income. So apart from the regular rental units, HKHS also provides some 900 elderly persons flats with at a concessionary rents, which is about 40% to 70% of the regular rental unit of the same estate. At present, we reviewed rents every 2 years. Rent adjustment is based on a number of factors, i.e., rental income must be sufficient to cover the recurring management expenses and our administration costs, and also to provide for major improvement works, repair and maintenance, and we take into account the affordability of tenants and other economic factors such as inflation and salary index. The mechanism has been adopted for many years. We believe the current rents are reasonable. At a per square meter basis, our rent is about $61 per month. For Group A, the average rent is about $1,900. On average, it's $1,900 a month. We have received from Mr. Kwok request to offer rental assistance. Yes, it was proposed some time ago, and we have been reviewing this for some time. We know that there are other assistance schemes. So for tenants who have difficulties in paying rent, we have registered social workers to provide follow-up services. Some 9% of our tenants are in receipt of CSSA, and some 20% of our elderly tenants are on CSSA as well. If they are on CSSA, CSSA would be sufficient to enable these tenants to pay rent, and this is also a long-term financial assistance. Our registered social workers also follow up cases in our estates to help needy tenants. And in some 146 cases where tenants have difficulties in paying rent, we have helped them to pay for the expenses for decoration, purchase of furniture, or electrical appliances. We help them to apply for assistance from other parties and other schemes. and this can provide appropriate relief to these tenants. I have met with a group of elderly tenants last week to sound out their wishes for assistance. Our colleagues will continue to follow up on specific cases. I understand the Housing Authority has completed a review on its rental policy, and we are going to conduct a review as well. We'll take on board the views expressed by our elderly tenants. It's question time for members. 4 minutes for members. The first one is Mr. Lau Kok Fan, and then followed by Deputy Chairman. Hong Kong Housing Society is a quasi-official organization. It also provides subsidized housing, but the Housing Society adopts practices that may be different from those of Housing Authority. I've received a petition from Kun Long Lau residents saying that the rental increase has been rather steep and much higher than that for Hong Kong Housing Authority tenants. They have a rental assistance scheme under the Housing Authority. In my constituency, I've been helping tenants to apply for assistance. If the total income or the total income to rental ratio is down to a certain level, they can have a full waiver or half rental waiver. Will the Housing Society introduce a similar scheme? We know more and more housing schemes have been completed by the Housing Society. In my constituency at Pt1 Road, there's a housing project which is to be completed by the Housing Society. You have some 20 rental estates and 32,000 units. I believe that there will be more in the future. You need to establish a system to regulate rental increase. Actually, when we're talking about tenants at the HAPLH, there are tenants of public housing. So are those in Housing Society rental estates. So if they have a rental assistance scheme and you don't have any, it's not really fair to your tenants. And also, secondly, you should have a mechanism to determine how the rent should be adjusted, and you should offer rental assistance. I have already set out the 3 factors that we would take on board in rental adjustment. I won't repeat them. From 2010, the rental adjustment of 3%, 2012, 6%, and then for 2 more years is 8%. So the last adjustment in 2016 was 8%, which was in line with inflation. And every time we would consult the tenants, and they have tenants alliance that we can talk to. We want to first make sure that it's affordable. Well, can you be more transparent? Consultation means that their views may not be heeded. For example, for this recent exercise, tenants raise objection to the rental adjustment in line with inflation. Are you going to really consider their views? Well, we're going to conduct a review at the end of this year. We've heard your views, and when the review is conducted, certainly all views will be taken into account. On the question of setting up a rental assistance scheme like that of Housing Authority, as I've said, there are other schemes which can assist our tenants in need, and we have registered social workers who can help them and make referrals, and we have some successful cases. This year, we're going to review our rental policy again. We're going to have a public hearing at a later, so I have to manage time strictly. Deputy Chairman and then Mr. Kwok Wai Kang. Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up question on the same subject. I'm just curious. I'm talking about the same issue. You talk about the factors that you would consider, and I'm concerned about two things. You mentioned that the increase is mild, 8% in line with inflation, but for 4 years before 2016, the inflation rate was low. 2014, 3.5%, 2015, 2.5%. So obviously, the rates of rental increase were much higher than inflation. So can you really rationalize what you did? Tenants are most unhappy about this because you increased rent much more significantly than housing authority. We know that both Hong Kong Housing Authority and Housing Society are tasked with public housing projects. And you also have for-profit housing projects. It seems that you concentrate your efforts on those. And for the rental projects, you are not as concerned or not paying as much attention. So people are talking about whether why there's no rental assistance scheme under Housing Society, like Housing Authority. You have not really explained why. It's not something the Housing Society would do. You make referrals to help them, but why is it that you don't have a rent assistance mechanism whereby the people who have difficulties to pay your rent can have a waiver? You could just spend some $200,000 a month and you can help all your tenants who are in need. Can you explain why there is no such mechanism? First of all, I would inform members that the Housing Society is a self-financing organization, so we have to manage our finances very prudently. We have to be very happy about the financial. We have to be very careful about financial viability of all measures. The last adjustment, last year's adjustment, is 8%, which is somewhat higher than the prevailing inflation rate, because for 2 years the inflation in relation to repair and maintenance is higher than in normal inflation, and we have to make sure that our rental income is sufficient to cover the repair, maintenance, and management expenses. For our operating accounts, it's a separate set of accounts. So this set of accounts will not be mixed up with other accounts such as investment, profits and loss of investments, because that would be risky. It's an independent set of accounts on management expenses, and our housing estates are aging, and we need to spend more to make improvements to our building stock. Sorry, because we scheduled to end this part at 3:05 p.m. because a public hearing will followed. But there are so many members who would like to speak. You want to cut the speaking time to 2 minutes? I want to give members every chance to speak, and I would defer the public hearing. But please stop if you don't need 4 minutes. I will now read out the list of members who would like to speak. If members do not raise their hands now, I'll draw a line, and that will be the list, the full list. Mr. Ko Wai Keung, well, you are going to increase rent. can you respond to the aspirations of Kunlun Lao residents, and that is the rates of increase should be lower than inflation? You talk about rental increases more or less on line on inflation, but the tenants are seeing their income increasing at a rate lower than inflation. So can you promise them that you will not increase rent at a rate higher than inflation? You have been looking at your surplus. Well, actually, Housing Society and Housing Authority are similar organizations. If you are really down and out financially, you would be getting some assistance from the government. There's no need to be too worried about your finances. You don't need to keep so much money in your accounts. So I will urge the Housing Society to provide rental assistance as early as possible to your tenants. There are the representative from the Transport and Housing Bureau on the board of the Housing Society. Has the issue of rental assistance ever been raised? Is it going to be provided by the Housing Society or from HA?
Well, once that they have entered Housing Society premises, then no one will care about them. So they are left to their own devices. Is that the case? Mr. Wong? Well, if you ask me right now to promise a certain % of increase, I can't give you that promise. We need to refer to some data. At the end of the year, when we have the data available, we'll start talking to relevant groups. Rental subsidy policy is something that Mr. Kwok has been asking us to do. We will include it in our agenda when we review our rental policy. I'm afraid Mr. Wong hasn't heard us. It's very clear. You can see it. Residents ask for the increase of rental next year to be lower than inflation. And Chairman, I ask for a public hearing after October so that residents can come to talk to us. Rental subsidy is something that is well practiced in the HA. For HS to do it, it will involve about $1 to $2 million because there are only 400 to 600 units under the HS. We're not trying to ask you to cough up a lot of money. For elderly residents, if you ask them to pay for higher rent every year, then they will eat into their savings. And in the end, they have to eat less and less just to make the funds available, and they are getting skinnier. Well, as you know that we have been asking for reduction of rental. After SARS, people's salary has been cut. However, for HS, they have been asking for rental increase. Well, now you come up with rent subsidy. I'm afraid that that is poison coated in sugar, because with rental subsidy they will introduce the well-off tenant policy. So you may offer a rent subsidy, but what comes afterwards? Would it be like the housing authority, that there will be a well-off tenant policy? If that is the case, residents of HS estates will be scared. So I want to ask if that is part of your intention. It's premature to talk about whether to implement other policies. We will have to carefully consider that. Has it occurred to you? Well, we have considered many different options, and of course we have considered the HA policies as well. But whatever we do, we have to take into account the feelings and also affordability of existing residents. Just now, Mr. Wong said that for Group A estates, the rental is about 1,000 or so. What about Group B? For Group B, the average is about 5,400 per unit. So the rental is higher than the PRH units. And if rental is increased every year, while their salary does not increase, it will be a heavy burden to them. Of course, the HS has to put in place measures to allay their burden. But if they refuse to do anything, there is nothing we can do. We can't even oppose to it. But I would like you to know that there may be rental subsidy, but something else will be packed onto it. If that is the case, I will oppose to it. So can Mr. Wong promise us that rental subsidy is not there in exchange for well-off tenant? This is not an exchange or a kind of precondition. For Group B estates, we charge a higher rental because the income and asset limits are higher than that of Group A estates. So the target group have a higher income and asset under the belt. As to what will entail in the rental subsidy program, we don't know yet, but of course we will take into account what members have said. I just want you to know very clearly that if we may support your rental subsidy policy, but we will oppose to well-off tenant policy. Residents in your estates may earn a slightly higher salary, but at the same time they pay a higher rent. And if you just copy everything from the HA, it's not good. Mr. Poon Siu Ping. Mr. Wong said that the rental adjustment mechanism is well practiced and well established, and you have to take into account inflation, maintenance, and repair costs. Of course, for residents, they don't want the rent adjustment to be higher than inflation. What are the weightings of these factors under your rent adjustment mechanism? You also talk about assistance rendered to tenants with financial difficulty. 9% of your tenants are recipients of CSSA, and about 20% of elderly households are CSSA recipients. And you also mention about in case a tenant has long-term financial difficulties in paying rent, they can ask to be transferred to other estates with lower rent. So I want to ask, in the past 3 years, how many such households have been transferred to estates with the lower rent? Mr. Wong. Well, first, the weighting. When we work out an estimate, our prime concern is that we need sufficient income to cover expenditure, and then we will take into account other factors, say for example economic situation and affordability. Of course, the weighting is mainly on making sure that we will receive enough to cover our expenditure. Your question about how many households have been transferred to lower rent estate, I don't have the information at the moment, and I will supply the same to you afterwards. So you talk about income. So You mean you will check the income of resident? No, our rental income to support our expenditure. That's what I meant. Anything to add? Well, if the maintenance and repair cost is astronomical, there is a chance that rent adjustment will be much higher than inflation. Well, that's how we work out our budget. We need the basis before we can proceed with our discussion. We will also take into account affordability of our residents as well as economic situation, that is wage movements and inflation. Dr. Fernando Zhang. There is no rental assistance under the Housing Authority. That unsettles your tenants, especially elderly households. Their asset is not so low that they can get CSSA, but they are living on their past savings. You said that there are about 900 elderly persons flats charging a lower rent, concessionary rents. If my math is right, let's say 1,000. That means 3% of your 32,628 units. Does it mean that that's all the elderly households you have under your flats? Well, how many households are there in your Group A estates? There are about 22%, that is 6,600 units, are elderly households. So, elderly persons' flats with a concessionary rent is a small number. Mr. Wong, you said you would consider rent assistance or subsidy. You've been saying that for many years. When will you be able to come up with a concrete plan? We said that this year we will conduct a comprehensive review. There are different forms of social benefits to help those in difficulty. We have in-house social worker, our service coordinators. In the past, we have provided assistance to about 146 cases and referred their cases to government departments for help. There is also the living allowance for old age living allowance on top of the old age allowance. In our comprehensive review this year, we will cover all the different types of benefits. We have heard requests to ask us to launch a rent subsidy just like that of the Housing Authority. Well, this is about helping elderly people to pay rent. The OALA is to help elderly people to make ends meet. So it's not overlapping with rent subsidy. It's to give them a sense of security. If rent keeps increasing, they will have to tighten their belt to pay rent, and that is not reasonable. So please don't consider those measures. Don't think that one-off relief measures will be able to alleviate the long-term financial burden brought by annual rent increase. So please, within this year, come up with some form of rent subsidy for low-income families. Mr. Horace Zhang. When the HA set rental, they have to make sure that rental income is sufficient to cover management expenses, administration costs, maintenance and repair, and to provide for major improvement work, repair and maintenance. Your estates are getting older, so maintenance cost will be higher. If you shift the cost in its entirety to tenants, does it mean that in the future the percentage of increase will exceed the affordability of tenants? If that is the case, what measures do you have to resolve the situation? When we work out the budget, the first thing we need to consider is that rental income is sufficient to cover our operating costs as well as make major improvement works. On top of that, we have to take into account the then economic situation and affordability. In our review last year, if we have to meet all these factors, the increase will exceed 8%. However, we take into account affordability, so we kept it at 8%. It's a well-established mechanism. We work out the budget, we take into account economic situation and affordability. Anything to add? No. Mr. Leung Yiu Chung, to be followed by Mr. Leung Kwok Hong. Just now, Mr. Wong kept saying that the rent adjustment percentage is reasonable and the adjustment mechanism is well established. Whenever I hear about increase in anything, of course, they will say is reasonable and the mechanism is effective. I don't believe anyone will come out to say that it's an unreasonable increase and the mechanism is not working. So it's meaningless to say these things. You talk about taking into account affordability and try to keep the percentage as low as possible. How come that the percentage increase over the years have been 3, 6, 8, and 8? Why not 3, 6, 8, 3, 6, 6, and 6? What data showed you that it had to be 8 instead of 6 or instead of 3? How come that the percentage is always on the increase? Well, if you have to provide for major works, the percentage will have to be even higher. You also talk about affordability and the economic situation. How come you work out that 8% means tenants will find it affordable? How come it could not be 6%? Well, I have to flaunt my age. You talk about reviewing the mechanism and provide rental subsidy. How many years have you talked about it? I have had a lot of conversations with you and we've had a lot of discussions in meetings. You kept talking about reviews and the situation remains the same. You said there are many different types of benefits available. You don't want any duplication and there are social workers helping them. I've heard enough of that. How do you assure us that this time the change is different? Well, Mr. Leung has made some comments. 3, 6, 8, and then 8. We took into account the economic situation and affordability. How come it was 8 instead of 6? Last year, if we had to follow the approach to make sure that expenditure is covered by rental income, it far exceeded 8. It will be over 10. Then why 8, not 6 or 7? That entails a number of things. The wage movement, wage index, inflation. Well, wage increase in real term is not as high as that, at most 3%. And inflation is only nominal, and that is the nominal wage increase. Well, you said, well, it was supposed to be 10, and now you've compressed it to 8. Then how come it's not 6 or 7? With the increase, we're talking about the $61 per square meters, which is about... So it's not about affordability. You take into account market value. You're diddling us. Mr. Wong, why do you diddle this old person? There is another old person coming, Mr. Lo. Well, I am 61 years old. HS, you started off with low rent accommodation. You first dealt with interim housing or squatter housing, and then you became an empire of your own. Where is your office? Where? 29th floor of the World Trade Center with a harbor view. When you go to work, it's like you're a tycoon.
So the security guards were told not to allow any outsiders to come, okay? You have high-end accommodation for yourselves. But then what about the poor people next door? You told them that you had to increase rents because there's inflation, because of prevailing market conditions and so on. What's the purpose of saving so much money in your coffers? So as Zhu Rongji said, well, for the state security people, you shouldn't just be doing your own business so that you would be accumulating your own reserves and surplus. So you always ask the state to give you money because you had to run your businesses. But then you're not doing your business, repair and maintenance, you're working on that, and you're also taking up decoration businesses. But what about the elderly people? So it's really infuriating. All right, the North Point site was so nice, and yet you ask people to pay you so much money in order to get the rental rights. But it's been a failure. All right, all your ideas didn't come to fruition. It didn't work out. So what's the point of accumulating so much money? So when it comes to helping the elders, what have you done? You're still resorting to double talk. You're still saying that, we have CSSA and also the double payment of CSSA. But then, do you know how much it costs to buy something from the fast food store? All right, I would have confiscated everything so that everything would be handed back to the housing authority. You've wasted so much of our money, and yet it's a failure. So, how much have you taken from the administration? You should have paid it back to us. You should have paid it back to the residents in Kwun Tong. So when I lost in the election there, I also had to go back and say sorry. All right, you didn't have enough money for offering subsidy to the elders. So are you in your right mind? So did you come back from outer space? You have to understand that the housing society didn't come out of the blue, because it's something that was born out of building low-cost housing for the poor. You have to remember your origin. So you should be doing your job. We're just asking you to lower your rents. So what about the 20%? Why can't you give it back to the elders as a bonus? So it's like the bus companies. So long as you've reached age 65, they are prepared to offer concessionary fare to the elders. They are the businessmen. And still, you have the nerve to say that here. So the North Point project has been a complete failure. Next, Lau Siu Lai and then Edward Yiu. Well, when I read the paper, I can see that they are increasing rents very drastically. If you if you thought that you'd been very reasonable, that's because you'd been thinking along the market rates and so on. But then for the private sector, the pay rise has been much slower than inflation. So even for minimum wage, it's only reviewed once every 2 years. So the income level has not gone up as you might have thought. In fact, you should not have increased rent that drastically. You should have actually lowered the rent in order to take into account the affordability of the younger generation. Even if you have to increase rent, it should not be done across the board. In fact, for some elders and also some young people, their income is low, and therefore they might be very worried and have a lot of anxiety about their future, because many elderly women have come to this council to approach different lawmakers, and they've been telling us that their life had been very difficult. Well, to you it might be just a very small sum, but then to them they have no income at all, and if you just increase the rent month after month, then they would be very anxious and worried, as Dr. Fernando Jiang just said, because well, for the subsidies that they have been receiving is not for the rental expenditure. In fact, they couldn't even afford to buy a cup of milk tea. Then how can they afford the high rents? Given the fact that they don't have any income. All right, you said that you've been looking at a basket of factors before deciding on the rate of adjustment, but then you just get the median income and also the average figure. And then in considering, you will also have to bear in mind that there are people living below the income line, and therefore you should have offered rent subsidy to them, because just think about them, because they've been in the same queue as those queuing up for PRH, and they had been in PRH under the HA, then they would be eligible for rent subsidy, and therefore I think you should have been fair to them. In fact, if you think in more pragmatic terms, how are the elders making their living? In fact, if you just increase rents year after year, then many elders would become suicidal, and many of them would have gone for euthanasia. So there have been lawmakers from different political affiliations, and they've been urging you to offer rent subsidy to them, or else the elders will be living in quagmire, and they would not be getting any assistance from under this policy. So please be pragmatic. You should have adopted the same approach as the HA, so that you would be offering rent assistance to these elders. Well, Mr. Wong, do you have any comments? No, I've heard her. Next, Professor Edward Yu. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I've read the paper, and I've also listened to what you said. Well, you said that the current rent review mechanism would cover, well, the market rent levels. But then for low-cost rental housing, you are leasing these flats to the low-income earners, and if you look at market situation, then it would be distorting the picture, because of government policy in recent years, I think market conditions have been rather awkward, and the rate of increase has been rather drastic, and if you compare that between 2014 and 16, and for the market rental increase, it went up by some 7.6%, and therefore you increase that by 8%. But then if you look at consumer price index C, actually it was only at it only stood at 3.6%. So it's just half the market rate that you looked at. And of course, in 2014, you actually increased it very modestly, because during the same period, the market rate went up by 14.8%, and you only increased that by 8%. So that shows that when the rental market has been distorted in such a manner, then even for you, which has a mechanism to offer low cost housing, if you make reference to the market rental, then you would be distorting it as much as the private market. So for those who are in need of rent assistance, you would actually be increasing their rents rather unreasonably. So why have you made reference to markets C and D instead of A and B? And also, would you try to delink yourselves from the market rents, as you have said? Mr. Wong, as I've explained, basically we would be looking at the rental income it must be sufficient to cover the recurrent management expenses and so on and so forth. We never compare ourselves with private market rental index, so there is no link whatsoever. But then that's what you said in the paper. We only make reference to that. So we make reference to the income factor and also the inflation rate. All right, that's in paper number CB bracket 1, 12, 15, stroke 16 to 17 bracket 01. And you said that the existing mechanism has been in place for many years, and you would be making reference to household income changes and market rents, rent increases, and so on and so forth. So you did not refer to what you said just now. You only said that you would be making reference to household income changes and the market rents. Well, Madam Chair, actually, well, we have set out the factors in para 2.1. There are 4 factors, and for the last 2, we only mentioned that because we would also take into other economic statistics, including inflation rate and also market rental and so on. But then we have already taken into account the other factors. All right. If you reject para 2.3, and if you just look at repair and maintenance costs, then you could have expected that the rate of increase would be higher and higher, because for repair and maintenance with an aging building fleet or building block, then the repair and maintenance costs would only go up. Mr. Wong, yes, Professor Yu is right, because last year when we look at our rental income, and it were to be sufficient to cover the recurrent management expenses and so on and so forth, we would have to increase our rent by 8%. All right, next, Dr. K.K. Kwok and then Shiu Ka-chun, because you'll be moving a motion. And then after Mr. Shiu Ka-chun, we also have Wilson Orr. And we have only been able to make a quorum now, so please do not leave, so that we'll be able to deal with the 2 motions as expeditiously as possible. Yes, Dr. K.K. Kwok. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, Mr. Wong, I think the KHS has not been doing its business at all, because since 2008, well, with phase 1 of Kun Long Lau, you have not launched any new units at all. On the contrary, you've been offering many high-end housing to the market. So how much would that be plowed back into low-rent, low-cost housing? Because you've been receiving some public subsidy, and then as a result of that, you've been making a lot of profits. And also, in terms of investment revenue, it's also rather shocking, because in 2015, if you look at the investment income, if I got it right, actually you've got some $2.03 or $2.3 billion in terms of revenue. And you said that your income has not been able to cover repair and maintenance. In fact, you do have money, because in terms of investment, and the administration has put in a lot of resources in you. And also when you sell flats in a private market, that money should have been used to subsidize the tenants. And even if you look at the URA, they would be offering assistance to the aging housing block to renew those blocks. Then how come you're calculating that in terms of your expenses and pass it on to the tenants? Well, for the repair and maintenance costs, how much have you used, and what's the percentage of it in terms of the rental revenue and so on, and also for the $2 billion and so on, and also the money that you got from selling flats to the private market, how much of that has been used on the elders? So it's a matter of left pocket and right pocket. I'm not going to mention things that you have done most outrageously, because you've been spending some $1.8 billion in purchasing a backup center and so on, and also you bought your office at World Trade Center and so on. And in fact, if you've been able to use the vacant school buildings and so on, then our tenants would not have been required to pay such high rents and so on. Thank you for looking or reading up so much of our literature. In fact, we have been involved in many of the URA projects. In fact, those would be sold in a private market at market rates. And of course, we also have to use our own resources to carry out the project, we also have to compensate the tenants. So it's like paying full land premium, and in some cases it's even higher than the land premium. So basically it's a market project, and there are also many risks involved. Well, initially when we started to do urban renewal projects, we expected to incur a loss, but then because of market changes, subsequently we managed to break even or even make some profits. And in terms of investment, well, investment market always has risk, because in the past we did incur some loss, and now there are also some investments that might yield some returns. But then, well, the reason why we need to have assets in order to sustain our operations, that's because we also have to redevelop some of the housing estates, and that would involve huge resources. And if we look at our own assets, we are only able to redevelop some 4 housing estates. We have 20 right now, and some 10 are rather run down. And we have to be very careful about this, because by a certain time we will have to redevelop them. That's why we've been making plans for how we are using our projects. Yes, we have spent some money to buy our office accommodation in Chuk Yuen, and the Causeway Bay office will be sold for or used for other purposes. Sorry, just one short statement. All right, can Mr. Wong give us the figures afterwards? All right, we are overrunning already. Mr. Chiu Ka-chun. Well, Madam Chair, I noticed that at the meeting, Mr. Wong has been jotting down a lot of notes, and whenever any member asks questions, he would jot down notes. But then basically they are very much the same questions, because we've been most unhappy about your answers, and you also refuse to conduct reviews and so on. Well, basically, if you do not respond to the request made, then there are bound to be repercussions and outcry. But then have you jotted down the word ugly? Or is it that you don't know how to write that down in the Chinese character 草? Because well, I read your website in 2016. That was in August, and the HHS is a non-government organization, and it provides housing and related services, and we strive to resolve the housing problem in a fair and just manner, so that in terms of property management and so on, we would be the leader in the field, and we provide quality housing, and we also offer resources in the most appropriate manner, and so on and so forth. Okay, I don't know to what extent you've been able to achieve your mission statement. Do you feel ashamed of what you have done? So what kind of innovation has there been? And also, what kind of world-class services have you been able to offer? All right, you talk about market conditions, but then as far as I understand it, well, in 2015, the inflation rate was 2.5%, and in 2016 is 2.3%, but then your rate of increase was 8%. And you also said that you had to take into account a basket of factors and so on and so forth. But then I think in this regard, you have not been able to meet our requirements, and you have not been able to convince us that you've been doing your job. And you also said that you'd be consulting the tenants, and you always adopt a customer-oriented approach. But then to what extent have you talked to them? Well, taking the tenants of Kuen Long Lau as an example. So during the last 6 months, on how many occasions have you talked to them? So you said that, well, or in fact, you've been avoiding to talk to them. And if you had been doing your job, then you should have changed your mission statement. Because when I read out the mission statement, just note that, well, you never mentioned the words self-sufficient. But then just now, you only emphasized that you had to be self-sufficient. So is it that the HKHS has changed, or is it that the world has changed? Mr. Wong? Well, the mission statement is our target, is what we strive to do, so that we'd be able to do what we pledge to do. And then being self-sufficient is also our motto, because if we are not able to be self-sufficient, then we cannot sustain. And to what extent I personally have been to the housing estate. Well, just last week, I talked to the elders in Kuen Long Lau, and our colleagues have been paying home visits to them. You can ask them. So we do understand the sentiments of the tenants, and also there are mutual aid committees which have maintained very close liaison with us, and we understand the needs and aspirations of our tenants, but then we do have our own mission and vision, and therefore sometimes they might be in conflicts. So that's all I'd like to supplement. Madam Chair, well, we are not going to compromise. I'll be moving a motion. So should I be reading out the wording of my motion? Sorry, just a moment. Time is very tight because we have a public hearing shortly. And also there are some questions which have not been answered, including the expenses on repair and maintenance. And Mr. Wong, you may supplement that after the meeting. And also when we asked you questions, you said that this year you're going to conduct a review, but then after the review, I understand that the HS has your own mechanism, and you can also decide when it's going to come into effect. But then after you have completed your review, can you come to this council as soon as possible to inform us what's the outcome of your review? Because I suspect that, well, by the time when you complete your review, it might be our next term already. But then even if I'm no longer the chairman, you would still have to report back to this panel. And you also said that, if you offer assistance, then you would also have to introduce a well-off tenant policy. But then it's not that easy, because when you have to investigate so many tenants, then you will require a lot of manpower. Instead of hiring more people to conduct the investigation, why don't you just offer the rent assistance or rent subsidy? So don't think about it. If you dare to propose it, it will not just be this council, but then in the society at large, there will be very strong repercussion, because how much money have they spent on investigating the well of tenants?
I have summarized our discussion in 3 points. Please come back as soon as you can. We have 2 motions, Mr. Siu Ka-chun and Mr. Wilson Orr. Mr. Siu, in view of the rental increase by housing society by 8% in 2016, which is higher than the inflation in that year and higher than the rate of salary increase, and in the view that some elderly tenants do not have incomes and they cannot afford the pressure brought about by rental increase, this panel urges the housing society to ensure that the rental increase for the next year will not be higher than inflation. Would those in favor of Mr. Siu's motion please raise your hands? For. Those against? No. Abstentions? No. So this motion is passed. Next, we have a motion from Mr. Wilson Orr. This panel urges Hong Kong Housing Society to provide a rental assistance scheme to tenants with financial difficulties, very much like the one offered by the Hong Kong Housing Authority. At the same time, the panel urges the Housing Society to base rental adjustments on the overall affordability of their tenants. And the SAR government should provide financial assistance to the housing society in carrying out the assistance scheme and major repair and maintenance at the housing estates. Would those in favor please raise their hands? Those against, please raise their hands. Abstentions? This motion is passed. Mr. Wong, please note the views of this panel. Thank you. We now move on to the next item. That is short and medium-term measures to alleviate the housing difficulties of residents of subdivided units. Please invite the deputations to join us. I wanted to give members ample time for the first item, so we had to start this part rather somewhat late. I have to extend the meeting time by 15 minutes. Please stay with me. There are 2 sessions for this particular part of our meeting. We're going to end the first one at about 5:15 p.m. and then we would have the next one after taking a short break.
OK， 咁咧就頭先咧，其實喺上一次嗰個議程講房協嗰
When we were at the Housing Society item, Mr. Chuk Yuen proposed a public hearing in the next legislative session. I may not be chairman anymore, so I will put this on the list of outstanding issues for the panel, and then the chairman at the time would decide when the hearing would take place. It's different from year to year.
我哋歡迎今日出席嘅官員。
I'd like to welcome government officials. The list is already tabled. I won't introduce them one by one. And in order to enable everyone to have sufficient time to speak, I hope the deputations would cooperate with us so that we can conduct our meeting in an orderly manner. If necessary, you can use the earpiece, and my channel 0 is a floor, channel 1 Cantonese, channel 2 English, channel 3 Putonghua. Every deputation has 3 minutes to speak. If you have written submission, please write down your name and hand it to our colleagues when you leave. I have to remind you that your speeches and your submissions are not covered by the Electrical Powers and Privileges Ordinance. Please also note that that we have a notice for people attending our meeting in the public gallery, which is also tabled for the deputations, and those who in the public gallery may get a copy from our security staff. I invite the deputations to speak one by one. I know some of you would like to display some slogans. I will allow that, but if that's too big and my sideline is affected, then I won't allow it. To save time, I won't introduce you one by one. We have the first speaker, Mr. Ho Chun Kit. Thank you. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the return of Hong Kong to China. In the 20 years, we have experienced rental increase. Rent has been much more expensive, and we are living in smaller and smaller flats, and there are grassroots people living in subdivided flats, and some even have to cook in the toilet. The ventilation is so poor, and it's like an oven in summer, and they are infested with fleas. So this is an inhumane accommodation. How can they have the mood to celebrate the unification? We have been told that by the government that they would build more PRH estates, but in the past 5 years they have fallen behind the targets, and the waiting time has become longer and longer. Every year the government keeps saying that they will build more PRH units, but there are no other means to propose to solve the problem. There are other countries with similar problems, housing problems, but there are NGOs, their governments would come up with innovative solutions. For example, they have some incentive schemes for the private property owners to rent their property to social enterprise or NGOs on low rent, and then the units can be leased to the grassroots people. So the government should do the same. For example, there should be tax incentive or tax allowance or reduced tax rates for the private property owners to come to participate in such a low rent housing schemes. And we should also ask social enterprise or NGOs to operate such schemes so as a countervailing factor to the uncontrolled private property market. And there are idle land in the New Town and in the NT. For example, this site in Kaiming Road, To Kwa Wong, or Muncheong Street. These sites have been left idle for years. I think the government should lease these sites for free under a short-term tenancy basis for 3 to 5 years to provide interim housing. And social enterprise or service agencies should build some temporary more modular housing units using the containers, and they will be different from the temporary housing we had in the past. Your time is up. Please give your submission, written submission to our staff for our information. Mr. Wan Zhongyin, housing problem is the #1 concern. For 14 consecutive months, the rental index has been on the rise, and the index for private rental levels has break new records. So for low-income people, they are facing very acute problems. Hong Kong is small and we have a big population. According to the Census and Statistics Department, in 2015, the per capita space is 62.4 square feet. But I think this is not accurate. According to CUHK, the per capita space in Hong Kong is under 48 square feet. Compared with Taipei and Tokyo, their governments have a lowest allowable per capita space is 141 and 199 square feet. The government must expeditiously set a per capita living space lower limit. Housing problem and problems with subdivided units should not be just eliminated. There should be step up in inflation. There should be standard on hygiene, and there should also be a registration system for the property owners so as to protect the interests of tenants. If we eliminate or we outlaw subdivided flats at a go, there will be a social crisis. The government should think twice about this. Back in the colonial era, 1945, the colonial government introduced rent control, but the SAR government cancelled it after the SAR government was established, saying that it wanted to protect the property market's integrity. But now rental levels are so high and people cannot afford to buy their homes. So we should protect people's right to tenancy. And the notice period under the tenancy agreement should be longer so that they have more time and more bargaining power. And also the tenants should have access to the mediation service to resolve disputes with their landlords. We hope that the SAR government will have the determination to solve this difficult problem, like the CY Leung, which only try to get solutions in a rush. Mr. Wong Ka-chun, we can talk about two groups of people. One living in subdivided flats at a high rent, and the other group are paying them a lot of their income for their mortgage. Housing is a necessity. Now it's become an investment project. It's more and more difficult to get a home. CY Leung said housing is among the top priorities. It's the top priority actually. And Mrs. Carrie Lam said the government will help people to get decent housing under the vision for 2030. The Hong Kong is set to be going to be a livable city. But when we talk about rebuilding the property market ladder, well, we can see that property prices and rentals are ever on the increase. It's a problem faced by not just subdivided unit tenants, but all people in Hong Kong. Especially, let's look at how the tenants of subdivided flats are doing. They are exploited. They face incessant rental increase, and hygiene is so poor. We have encountered cases of spalling concrete, and if a balcony even fell and collapsed. The UN already said that in June 2014, the Hong Kong suffers from underinvestment in housing, and many people are living in substandard housing. Housing, like education and health care, is a basic right. The government must make sure that the housing right is realized in Hong Kong. We're not just talking about roof over one's head. We should not allow the housing to be a subject of speculation. Housing should be a right which will afford people safety. And there are a number of standards in that UN document which I won't sell out. But we need to protect right to tenancy, and we make sure rent is affordable, and the housing structure will not pose any danger to those living in it. This is a basic right of all Hong Kong people. The government should consultation widely, and we should protect tenancy right. And there should be a per capita space and density standards. We have one for public housing, but not for private housing. In the UK, Taiwan, and other countries, they have promulgated such standards. The government should be more determined in solving housing problem. Mr. Lam Siu Pan. I am Lam Siu Pan from a community concern group. I have a serious problem for the new Secretary for Transport Housing. Where has Mr. Chan Fan gone? This is the first working day of the new term government. Why isn't Mr. Chan here? Is that the new government under Mrs. Carrie Lam will be interactive and will be flexible in the communication that they are going to conduct? I hope Mr. Chan Fan, the new secretary, would visit the subdivided flats and listen to the views of all those tenants first person. In 2012, I was a probationary social worker in Tai Kwok Choi, and I had to visit tenants of subdivided units regularly. And there were so-called coffin units. It's a very small unit, and then we have 10 to 20 coffin-like units. Actually, it's a bed space measuring 3 by 8 feet, and the tenants had to pay $1,400. The per square foot rent is was much higher than high-end housing, and I was very surprised. Hong Kong is an international cosmopolitan city, and why were so many people living in such a poor housing? And this problem of subdividing units is getting more and more serious. The government's statistics tell us that there are 66,900 in units in 2013, and now in 2015 there are 87,600 such units involving altogether 200,000 people, and 42% of those are waiting for public rental housing units. So they do need help from the government. Subdivided units tenants are suffering from high rent. According to government statistics, the median income is 4,200 for a subdivided unit. If they are allocated a PRH unit, the average rent is just 1,800, and the environment is poor. Subdivided unit tenants only has 4.5 square meter in living space per capita. For the counterparts in public housing is 13.2 square meters. The housing authority has a standard for overcrowded units. Your time is up. Mr. Chan Wing Tung would like to have interim housing provided. We should make the best use of idle, unused school campuses. This in June, we asked the housing authority to respond to this issue. They kept saying that there is a lack of suitable size, and suitable size should be used for PRH instead of interim housing. And sometimes, if we build interim housing, infrastructure will be required, and they think that this is not a viable solution. But they are not actually properly responding to our aspirations to have interim housing. PRH, of course, can help tenants living in subdivided units, but is this the only solution? Because the public rental housing building program is lagging behind the targets. By 2020, we will be lagging behind by 30% in the public housing building program. When asked, Mr. C.Y. Leung said that there will be 75,000 units coming on stream, but at the end of his term, there are only 49,000 would be built. So that's a difference of 16,000, the equivalent of 1 year's building volume.
Does it mean that we don't have any land in May? There has been about 183 vacant school premises. Most of them have been left vacant for more than 5 to 6 years. They have never been used for a very long time. Do you rather keep them, let rats use them? So there should be a decision about to use these vacant premises. 17 of the 183 vacant school premises will be used for residential development. I hope that these sites will not be turned into luxurious flats, but PRH units, that is public housing units. And there is still a window from developing and actual completion. I hope that the window period can be used to build some interim housing. There are already basic facilities put in place, say for example bathrooms. You only need simple conversion for people to live in these vacant school premises. 105 school premises will be kept as government institution and community use. Next, Ms. Lau. Thank you. Subdivided flats offered an appalling living environment. It's so hot and the environment is so poor that it's dangerous for people to live in. Say, for example, in Hong Kong last week, there was the case of a balcony collapsing. It's in a tenement building, and it's found that it's rather dilapidated. So people who live in subdivided flats don't know when their room will collapse. And there's also a case in Cheung Sha Wan. There was a fire. The subdivided flats residents living upstairs said that they are fully aware of the fire risk. They are also aware that the fire escape has been blocked, so they can't escape should there be a fire. So that resident leave a rope hanging out of the window just in case that they need to climb down from it. So they don't know when the roof will cave in. They don't know when there is a fire. There is no guarantee about safety of their lives if you live in subdivided flats. We do need to increase housing supply. We are aware of the serious shortage of land. It's difficult to identify land. In the coming 5 years, there will be 18,900 flats to be completed. But it falls far short of the 28,000 target or demand. So it's a drop in the ocean. How can the government solve the subdivided flat problem? I know that there will be some flat resumption in Kowloon City. There will be over 1,000 units. So from the beginning to the last one, it will take 3 to 4 years. People will have to wait for that long. It's a lifetime for them. You may consider you letting families with an urgent need to move in these flats and then wait for the entire building to be acquired before you identified alternative accommodation for them. The government can also conduct a territory-wide inspection of subdivided flats, taking stock of subdivided flats in commercial buildings, industrial buildings. So when there are support measures launched, they will have the data and they will be able to identify the households to give them help. Hello, I'm from the Labour Party. Well, this subdivided flat problem, it doesn't just happen today in Hong Kong. Well, people face a lot of problems. And it's not just, for some people, it's not about when they will be able to save up to pay for the down payment. For some others, they're only waiting for a PRH unit, public housing unit. A couple of days ago, I talked with a PRH tenant. I was helping this tenant for about 4 years. From the day when the application was made to when the flat was allocated for a 4-people household, well, that person thought that 3 years is all it would take, but it's taken 7 years in the end. Before they are allocated a flat, a lot of people live in subdivided flats, and they face a lot of problem because owners evict them or increase rent. The Labour Party previously in Chuk Yuen conducted a survey to find out the price per square foot of subdivided flats in Chuk Yuen. Let me give you some idea. Tai Ho Road with lift 6,500 per square foot, so $65 per square foot. And 2 years ago in Sanpo Fong, there was a case involving a fire killing someone. It can fetch 4,500, 100 square foot with no lift. It's the cheapest in Chuk Yuen because next door is a flat where someone has died. We're talking about $45 per square foot. So whether it's 65 or 45, it's still higher than the rental of a new flat in Chuk Yuen. That would only fetch about $55 per square foot. Subdivided flat residents don't know when there will be a fire, when they will lose their lives, when the landlord will put up the rent. They only ask for rent subsidy to help them. However, the subsidy under the Community Care Fund has been cancelled. We've been asking for rent control. That's what the Labour Party has been asking for. Well, we want the government to care about the right to have a place to live, and I don't want to see another tragedy happening. Mr. the Census and Statistics Department said that 200,000 people have been living in subdivided flats. I think it's a serious underestimate. There can easily be about 400,000. They said that 41% of them said that it's all right, 31% of them said that it's satisfactory, and 20% of them are not happy. When I was young, I've been living in wood partition flats, and I did not like it at all. In some subdivided flats, you find that the environment is really nice. Well, you have to consider the limited space and also fire risk. The Liberal Party has been asking for increasing land supply, make good use of rock cavern, and expedite the development in the new development flats, and also reclaim land, release industrial estates, turn them into interim housing so that subdivided housing residents can use it. There can be there can be rent allowance, say for example 5 year, a maximum of $100,000 per year as tax allowance for people who are renting. In 2011 and 12, we garnered support from other political parties, but the government did not take that on board. When it comes to subdivided flats, the government is always very afraid. We ask for a licensing regime, which is also a regulatory regime. There are hundreds of thousands of people living in the subdivided flats. The government thought that, well, once there is licensing, then the rental will be jacked up. But subdivided flats have been in Hong Kong for 100 years or so. The buildings department may be afraid that there is insufficient manpower. Well, landlords may evict tenants because they don't want to bear criminal liability. But if you require these subdivided flats to put in place fire services installations, that every unit should have a window, I think that will ensure life and limb to be protected. Some people ask for rent control. It's useless. Landlords will be more picky. If you don't have income proof, then you will not be chosen. Grassroots will find it more difficult to rent. So with licensing, with regulation, then the problem will be solved.
Sarah Abbas, you have 3 minutes.
Good afternoon. I am Saira from Diocesan Pastoral Center for Workers. Actually, I want to talk about general situation of ethnic minorities residents living in subdivided flats. It is almost difficult for EM to find a flat. Many property agencies are now putting some signs on their doors that EMs are not allowed or they will be not served. Even they are willing to serve EM, they will be offered very high rents, and almost one whole salary will go for rent. Situation of those subdivided flats are unexplainable. Poor ventilation, narrow space, and it seems that they are put in the jails. Breadwinners in family has to do 2 jobs in order to manage all expenses. On other hand, applying for public rental houses is very difficult for those families without any proper guidance and support from housing authority. Even if they are successful to apply public housing, they still need to wait for years. And as private house tenant, their rights are not protected. They are not aware of rules and regulations in the contract. A research recently done by our organization shows that over 50% of the contracts are written only in Chinese. It means that they totally don't understand the terms and conditions written in Chinese. So many disputes occurs, and then what happens that when they are asked, they said that landlord didn't explain to them, especially for the repairing work, that sometimes there is need to repair something in the flat, and when landlord is asked, and he will say that actually I am not the one responsible for repairing. So when we check the contract and we find that it was written in the contract, but tenant don't know about that. So I want to request low income working family allowance to consider expenses also, so that low income families should be really benefited needed. I want to request government to consider for restarting of community care fund subsidy on permanent regular basis so that it could be a great help for subdivided flat tenants. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next is Mrs. Sana Amjad. And again, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Sana from Equal Access Group. Today I want to share my housing problem. I moved to Hong Kong with my parents when I was very young. When I rent this private flat, it's looked quite okay with reasonable price. Actually, it was a flat make on rooftop and luckily building have lift also. So I like the place. Soon after I move in and after few days when it's rain, there's a big typhoon came and whole roof starting to leak. There was water everywhere. My husband and me spent whole night waking up and trying to pull out water. When I contact landlord and talk to him over this matter, and he said I may leave the flat if I do not like. And he also said that he will not return me any deposit and contract is for 1 year. We do not have any choice but to live there. Later on, I contact social worker is Catholic Center and he helped me to talk to landlord and convince him for repairing. He did repairing but the problem is same. I need to wake up night when it rains. There is no protection for tenant in Hong Kong. Landlord got power to do anything. I need to pay more than legal utilities charges according to landlord choice. Finding a new flat for ethnic minorities seems to be impossible. Many property agents will even not let us in when they find we are Pakistani. Government should do something in this regard, like making must in the contract. Landlord should be honest enough to mention all the structures and others problem in the flat. There should be some protection for tenant no matter what race or nationality they belong. If landlord is not the one to make repairing, the government should give some subsidies to make repairing work possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you. 跟住下一位係蕭偉先。
Next is Mr. Siu. I now live in a subdivided flat that cost me $5,800. It's a family of 4. I have children living in kindergarten and primary 1. I asked the government to produce more land, to make good use of vacant school premises, to turn them into interim housing to help us grassroots so that we don't have to live in fear, having to move house all the time, and that we have to pay more and more for utilities. We ask for rent control so that landlords won't put up the rent by 1,000, 2,000 to kick us out. Thank you. Next, Mr. Chen. When it comes to subdivided flat, we think in the long run the government should increase land supply in order to resolve the problem once and for all. In the short term, we think the government should propose measures to remove barriers to allay the problem so that in the long run the problem can be resolved and subdivided flats residents will see an improvement in their living environment. I have a number of suggestions to make. First, to put in place measures to allow subletting under social enterprises. It's not the case that there are no vacant available premises. It's because for various reasons a lot of the units have been left unused. We've talked to social enterprises. They found a program adopted overseas to enable social enterprises to take over vacant housing units and then let them out so that there will be more available premises to allay the increase in rental. We ask to put in place rental subsidy for those who have been waiting for PRH units for more than 3 years, who are renting in the private sector. We asked the government to identify in the new territories small sites that are not suitable for residential construction program. Instead of leaving them vacant, these sites should be turned into interim housing. Perhaps they can work with social enterprises. A lot of grassroots families are waiting for PRH unit. These are short-term measures that are worth considering. We understand that in the long run, more PRH units will allay the problem of subdivided flats, but still you need some short-term measures. We would like to provide more choices for those living in subdivided flats to allay dissatisfaction or grievances in society. We found that apart from, sorry, your time's up. Next, Mr. In recent years, we hear from the government announcing statistics about the subdivided flats starting from 2013 to 2015. We see the figures of the government. 170,000 starting from 2013 living in subdivided flats. In 2015, it has risen to close to 200,000. The figure has been climbing. However, the government continues to be inactive. They kept talking about increasing PRH supply. Well, for short and medium term, there is nothing. The rent subsidy under CCF has been taken away. In Kwaichung, in 2013, that is the year when the government announced statistics. At that time, for 100 square foot, it will only cost you 3,000. Recently, we see that well, you can't do it without $5,000 or $6,000.
So rents in all districts have been rising, and yet the administration is still sitting back and doing nothing. And also for water charges and so on. All right, in the past, what people used to pay about $100 for a small unit, and now they are charging some $3 per unit of power. So the administration is still doing nothing and sitting back, and so they are still claiming that by increasing supply, the problem will go away. So you're talking about senior officials in a bureau. They have just taken their post. So is it that the only solution to the problem is by providing more public rental housing? I think people are already living in dire strait. All right, 2 or 3 years ago, the administration introduced this survey, and that was a thematic survey on housing conditions and so on. Many groups have been urging for the government to introduce rent control, but then the administration said that there will be fewer units available in the market, and that's what some of the speakers just said. With rent control, there will be fewer rents or fewer units available for rent. Well, in 1998 and in 2004, after the scrapping of rent control, did the number of units increase substantially? If that it didn't, then why would you say that by introducing rent control, the number of flats available for rent will be cut? So I think we should review the policy on rent subsidy or rent or tenancy control. I think we should also relaunch another program for low-income earners, and also for tenancy control or rent subsidy. It should be made available for those who have been waiting for more than 3 years in a queue, and also some vacant flats should be made available and turned into interim housing or transitional housing. Next, I'm representing Kwai Chung, and I'm living in a 100 square feet subdivided flat. I'd like to say that rents have been very high, and I don't know how long I have to wait before I can be allocated public rental housing. And there are many vacant school premises. For example, block 10 or 11. Well, they're actually allowing them to remain vacant and only can go into those flats and humans are not allowed in. Next, Fong Lok Yim, Ms. Fong Lok Yim. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Recently, we paid visits to many tenants of subdivided flats in Kwai Chung, and they said that the rents have been very high, and also the water and power charges have been very high. They understand that the landlord have been overcharging, and the rents have been going up all the time, and yet they are concerned that they might be evicted by the landlord any time, and the landlord also did not have to worry that those subdivided flats would not be rentable, and therefore, well, adequate housing is basic human needs and is also their basic human rights, and therefore the administration should relaunch tenancy control so that the landlords will not be allowed to increase flat rents too substantially, or else the tenants would have to be silenced. And the CCF's subsidy for the don'ts should be relaunched, so that that would also help ease the pressure. We would also like to have more transitional housing, because according to the planning department's survey in May, well, if you look at the number of vacant school premises, we had 183, and if these school premises can be turned into interim housing, then that would also help ease the pressure on those living in subdivided flats, because they have urgent needs. Next, Ms. Kwok Wing Yin. Well, good afternoon, Madam Chair. I live in a subdivided flat in Kwai Chung. Well, there are many public rental housing that have been left vacant, and yet the administration will have to resume it. In fact, people can afford to pay rent. Well, or they'd be prepared to pay $1,000. In fact, for those on individual visit scheme, they'd come over and stay in those flats for a few days. Well, how come you do not release those flats? Because I know there are people living in those flats. Because, well, how come there are 3 or 4 people living in the same flat, and yet they are not consuming any power or water, and they should have returned or surrendered the flats to the HA, but then they'd rather not, because if they have friends and relatives coming over from the mainland, they can allow them to stay there for a while. Well, and yet nothing has been done about it. So for those of us from the lower rung of society, well, we have no resources and no nothing, and for how long do we have to wait? Next, Mr. Ho Ka Chun. Thank you, Madam Chair. We're of the view that, well, the housing panel has decided to hold this public hearing, and the administration has been urged to introduce short to medium term measures to ease the pressure of those living in SDUs. In the past, the Bureau, either is Ms. Wong or Mr. Ying, who is the permanent secretary for the Bureau, when they came to respond to the requests made by groups, they've been saying that they would be identifying land for public rental housing and also for housing development. And on top of that, there's no other measure to help us. So today, the theme is on the short to medium terms measures to alleviate the housing difficulties of tenants of subdivided flats. I hope that they would not be evading the issue again. Well, for this new term of government, or under the CY Leung government, what they've been claiming that, well, when it comes to housing policy, they've been talking about buying one's homes and so on. But then, does it mean that everybody in Hong Kong will have to buy their own homes? In fact, there are people from different districts, and there are also many groups out there, and many of them have been listening in, and they might be coming to air their views in the next session. Many people are still leasing their flats or living in subdivided flats. Does it mean that these residents do not have any housing needs? Does it mean that they all have to purchase their own flats? In fact, rents have taken up a very big share of their income, 40–50%, so they have problem making ends meet, and yet the administration has been telling them that they will have to buy their own flats. Well, they can't even afford to pay rents, then how can they afford to buy their own flats? So the administration will have to think about it. what measures will be needed to really help these people. They are from the lower rung of society, and many have talked about transitional housing and also rent subsidy and so on. And the administration has been saying that tenancy control would be a problem. But then there are residents, well, who are facing this problem. After the expiry of the tenancy agreement, the landlord will be increasing their rent by $1,000, $2,000. And as a result of that, they've been forced out, and they are no longer able to afford to rent the original flat. They will have to look for other flats. In fact, they have no bargaining power at all, and they are facing rent hikes by the landlords, and they can only identify or find lower rent flats. And if they do not have any bargaining power, then after a long while, they will still be evicted by the landlords in the excuse of rent hike. And they'll have to go further and further away from downtown, so they have no bargaining power. So is it that tenancy control should be relaunched, or else what measures can be there to help them? Next. Well, with regard to subdivided flats in industrial buildings, the administration has been stepping up law enforcement, and as a result, many tenants have been forced out. For example, in Kwai Chung, the Chiwa industrial building is an example, and some 12 households and 23 tenants have been affected, and they have been evicted, and they have nowhere to turn to. So that shows that the administration's support and also the industrial building policy has been flawed with problems, and as a result, well, many industrial buildings have become the only alternative for households before they become street sleepers. In fact, they've been waiting for a long time for public rental housing because they cannot afford housing in the private market, and they have to move into industrial buildings, which might cost them some $1,000, $2,000 a month, because they simply cannot afford private housing in a private market. And when they are forced or evicted, well, the only alternative is to go into industrial buildings so that they would wait for another clearance operation. At present, the administration does not have a good support policy for those living in subdivided flats, and there is also no statistics on the tenants, and they just step up enforcement. So in fact, they are actually allowing the landlords to fight with the tenants, and for those living in Chiwa, they spend a month's time to negotiate with different government departments asking for rehousing and also support, and in the course of that, they have been taking up a lot of pressure and stress, and only on the 30th of June, which was the last day before their removal, and under the arrangement of the ledge code, they managed to sit down and see how the matter can be followed up. And in fact, they actually asked to meet with Mr. Ying, who's the permanent secretary of the bureau, so that some 2/3 of the tenants can be rehoused into the Shackley interim housing. But then they've been told that well, public housing is a scarce resource, and for various reasons, some buildings will have to be demolished, and the Shackley interim housing, which is the only interim housing in the downtown area, and that would also have to go. So in fact, this is not a simple matter, and for many tenants, they can only move from one industrial building to another industrial building, and therefore we have to have a comprehensive policy before we can resolve the problem. Once again, we'd like to urge the administration to adopt a short to long-term policy to resolve this problem. Well, for the short-term policy, you will have to introduce the end-nothing allowance, and also there should also be tenancy control. And then for rooftop housing and so on, well, before you take enforcement action, you will have to rehouse them before you demolish the structures, and you should also make better use of the present interim housing resources, so that for those in need, they can also go into interim housing in Shackley and Tuen Mun. Thank you. Next, Ms. Chen Wei Heng. Thank you. I live in Kwai Chung. Is a subdivided flat. We are a family of 4, and we live in a small room of several dozen square feet. And initially, well, it was decorated, but then after we moved in fact, there were moles on the entire wall, and I tried to call up the landlord, and I told him about the problem, but then he wasn't willing to take any action, and we couldn't even open the window. And then as soon as you open the window, there would be mosquitoes flying in, and my children are very small, and they might be sick for once or twice a month because of their very weak immunity. And they had just come to Hong Kong a short while ago, and they were not able to adapt to school education. They couldn't understand what the teacher was saying. And then we all stayed in this very small room. And then after they have done their homework, they could only stay in bed and play between themselves. So for my young children, they are not able to adapt to this very cramped environment, and there is no space for them to play. And my younger daughter became very erratic and short-tempered, and whenever she had nowhere to turn to, she'd go out and take a walk. And for the landlord, he couldn't care less about the condition in our room. So for the 4 of us to stay there, it's very noisy because the children are very short-tempered, and they are having a hard time, and they'd be staying in the same space. They had to be in bed all the time. They had their meals while they were in bed, and they would be doing their homework in bed, and they would also be playing in bed. And as a result, they become very short-tempered, and they would throw the books around because they are really very irritable. And whenever I cook, the whole room would get very smoky, and the smaller daughter would just vomit and throw up. And I myself also become very depressed. And I also have this problem. When I go out to do my grocery shopping, I would also become very depressed. You will have to resolve the housing problems for us. Thank you. Next, Mr. Nigel Lam.
我已經入咗個 paper 俾你哋㗎啦。
I've submitted the paper to you. So I think I share the sentiments of the lady who spoke just now. She is a family of 4, and how could we do that in 3 months? All you need to do is to refer to the submission that I gave you. And after reading the paper, so are there any avenues available for me to apply for sites for these temporary structures? Because the temporary structures do not require power supply, so they are totally self-contained, and even sewage can be treated within those containers. In fact, all you need to do is to read the submission that I gave you. So in 6 months, these women, they will be dealt with. The whole problem can be resolved. I also have a scheme. That is, if you allow me to come up with more permanent structures that can last 5 years, and it only takes less than a year to do it. You don't have to translate for me. So I'm just telling him. So he's a representative from the government, and I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. We have to facilitate our simultaneous interpreters. Well, I'm not here to facilitate their work. Okay? You can give me a written reply.
Dealt with and benefited. 你有個新司啦，佢話。
All right. You have a new chief executive, and she claims that she's pragmatic and she would be doing her job. Next. Thank you, Madam Chair. What I'd like to say is, well, just now, many speakers have talked about the problem of subdivided flats and how resources can be distributed and waiting time shortened. Well, apparently, whatever we say, nobody will take heed of it. Because for those who are well off, they don't understand our plight. So they are completely ignorant of our needs. I'm not jealous of what people have and where they are living. Well, for those who have good accommodation, well, just imagine when several people have to be crammed into a small room of several dozen square feet in a scorchy hot day. And then really think about those of us who are living in dire strait. In the past, you talk about a waiting time, an average waiting time of 3 years. Then it's 4 years, 5 years. Well, I've waited for 7 years already, and still there is no end in sight as to for how much longer I have to wait. And then there are people who manage to get units much faster. I'm talking about public rental housing. Well, in the past, in my hometown, it's like this. I'm referring to several decades ago. Well, nobody would be able to get the meat coupon and also the food coupon. All right, everybody would only be entitled to 3 tails of meat. And there's a father, and then the son told the father that he had to go and buy some pork. All right, the dad was working, and he waited till his dad was off duty, and then he queued up in a long queue, and then he waited for 2 or 3 hours before he was able to buy 2 or 3 tails of pork. So do we also have a fair government like that in Hong Kong, to ensure that everybody would be waiting equally for public rental housing? Well, did anybody are you able to ensure that no one would be able to jump the queue? Well, I understand that there are some vacant flats, and you do have vacant flats which are quite spacious. And why are you not allowing people to go in? Next, in the past few years, in fact, the number of subdivided flats has been going up. And yesterday, there's an exhibition on. There's a picture exhibition showing the conditions of subdivided flats. In fact, many of them have the size is very small, and the conditions are very appalling. And all right, the flat has been subdivided, and even the tenants had to pay very high rents.
The tenants do not have any written tenancy agreement signed with the landlords, and very often the landlord would extract exorbitant tariffs for water and electricity, and the government has drawn a blank in helping them. To the government, subdivided units don't seem to exist. I remember a dialogue from a Hong Kong film. Don't treat yourself that everything is okay. After NGOs have been asking for this for a long time, the CCF Community Care Fund has provided an allowance for those so-called N-nothing people. For these, this is the only support given to the tenants of subdivided units. But after 3 years, this allowance, for no reason, was scrapped, and therefore these tenants suffered. And why? Has their difficulty been removed? Why is it that while they are finding it more and more difficult to cope with living, and the government has cancelled the allowance? We have published this pamphlet introducing different medium and long-term measures to help them. Please consider this. The government has failed to do anything in the past few years, but the community has been very active in coming up with innovative help. For example, we have proposed using vacant school premises and idle housing stock to help them, or to provide an allowance to them until they get public rental housing. And also we can ask social enterprise to act as the estate agent to help them get accommodation. But all these will require government policy for support. For example, we should have a list of vacant school sites from the Education Bureau. We should streamline the procedure for changing of land use, and there should be more support service to landlords and tenants, and also the reintroduction of rent control. Thank you. Mr. Zhang Chonghang. The roots of all these problems lies in lack of land. We all know that the problem, the issue is how can we make the best use of our land. The government will come up with short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures to resolve the problem of shortage of land. Many speakers have already proposed rezoning of vacant school sites, and also the introduction of a vacant property tax, so that the landlord would rent their properties instead of leaving them idle and vacant. And for young people who want to buy their homes, paying the down payment is difficult. But perhaps the government should introduce the first-time home buyer loan scheme to help them. In the medium term, can we relax the building height of public rental housing blocks so that we have more units and more units for allocation? And there are many vacant agricultural lots in the NT. Maybe we can rezone those sites for the property, for residential properties. And we need to redevelop our very old building stock. Many of the buildings were built soon after the Second World War, and many were built during the period when fresh water was in short supply. In To Kwa Wan, there are many old buildings which are not properly maintained. There have been cases of windows falling onto the street because of the inability of landlords to maintain their properties properly. And we should make use of caverns so that land can be released for other uses. And also outside the Victoria Harbour, we should go for more reclamation. This is an idea already proposed by the government. But should we do more in the reclamation in NT? Lastly, I hope that everyone in Hong Kong would get good and standard accommodation. Mr. Lee Mei Mei. Good afternoon. I'm Lee Mei Mei from Western District. I represent some grassroots people living in the Western District. We're facing rate rental increase over the years. We are living in smaller and smaller units with a higher and higher rent and paying higher and higher rent. Many old buildings have now been demolished for redevelopment, so there's not much affordable accommodation for us. And we cannot afford those new flats. On the 9th of July 2004, with the amendments bill on the landlord on the tenants ordinance passed, tenants' rights were deprived. The notice to quit is just 1 month in advance instead of a year, and we are paying very high water tariff and electricity tariff, and landlords will not even do the most basic maintenance work. And some of us have been asked to pay the rent for 6 months upfront, and many of us have been evicted by the landlord and or forced to leave by high rent. The tenants' rights should be protected. Well, there has not been any review on the landlords and tenants ordinance for 13 years. So how can it protect tenants' rights? So it should be reviewed. Rent should be controlled. The law should be reviewed. The rent should be controlled. Please return tenants' rights to us. Ms. Young, Wong. You can start now. Please stick to the mic. Madam Chair, members, good morning. I'm from a family of 3. We live in a subdivided unit in Shangshui. My daughter is in primary 4. She's 11 years old. For just a unit of more than 100 square feet, the rent is 5,800, not counting water and electricity, so it's 7,000 in all. So that's already half of my family income. So it's getting tougher and tougher for my family, and I don't know how many more. How much longer I have to wait for public rental housing. The estate agent also asks us to pay the stamp duty, $500 to $800. And if we cannot afford to the new rent, we'll ask to leave. And then the unit can be leased to another for a higher rent. And they're asking us to pay higher and higher water tariff and electricity tariff. Although I learned from the news that the CLP has not increased its tariff for these years. And there's no meter. And we do not have any tenancy agreement, therefore no protection for us. My condition is similar to the one referred to by the other speaker. We're facing the same difficult situation. I almost cried when I heard what she said. The government should reintroduce the CCF allowance so that those who are not on CSSA can be helped a little bit. The government should, of course, build more public rental housing units so that grassroots people like us who are living in subdivided units can be allocated these PRH units. And the government should redevelop old industrial buildings and turn vacant school sites into interim housing, which would increase the revenue for the housing department, and we people living in subdivided units will also get better accommodation. Mr. Tang Hao Tung. Well, I've recently visited tenants of subdivided units in Pt1. They're facing similar problems, spoiling concrete from the walls and even from the external wall of their buildings. They think that they are facing risk of personal injury, and the building would collapse any time. According to some press reports, because of units are subdivided, the risk of a building collapse is even greater. So they are very concerned whether the building they live in may collapse any time during the night, and their living conditions are really dangerous, and they have no sense of security. So that they don't want to live in such conditions. And also, rent is very expensive. If we look, let's say for a unit of 100 square feet in Pt1, it's $6,000 to $7,000 a month. I once visited a subdivided unit with a single mother taking care of 2 children. the 2 children will be taken to a child care center, and the single mother would have to work after that, and she had to pay $2,000 out of income of $8,000, and still there are 2 daughters for her to take care of. The government should implement measures to provide interim housing. We should make use of vacant school sites and maybe also industrial buildings for such housing. Ms. Jie Ying, where we heard from many speakers and deputations the difficulties faced by tenants of subdivided units. I don't think these problems would come as a surprise to the officials over there. So I would like to ask whether the officials are determined to do something about the ineffective property market and the lopsided bargaining power of landlords and tenants. Well, the long-term housing strategy talk about many long-term vision, but is short on solutions for present-day problems. And they've been trying to meet the 3-year waiting time target by recovering the units from sitting tenants. According to the housing department, there are more than 379,000 people on the waiting list for PRH. If the government, the new-term government, has taken office, if it's determined to solve the problem, maybe we can use our sites for other types of housing to build more PRH units. Many deputations have proposed rent control. The form of rent control can take many different ways and means. For example, the notice period is just 1 month. In the past, it was as long as a year. Perhaps the notice period should be 3 months, so that grassroots people and even middle class will be given sufficient time to find alternative accommodation when they are asked to leave. And also the existing tenants should enjoy a priority to have the tenancy renewed. And also we should address the problem of charging tenants very high water tariff and electricity tariffs. And also we should mandate that only reasonable tariffs be collected from the tenant. And also the landlord should be responsible for the maintenance and repair. Some tenants are now asked to maintain the air conditioners in the unit, and even for the removal of broken down units, broken down air conditionings. And we should try to make use of different ways to provide more units, like industrial buildings. My group is in the North District, where the people that we offer service to are the tenants of sub-units. But they have gradually moved on to the rural area. They are now living in units converted from old and unused pigsties. So that's what they will face in the coming 5 years. And there are elderly people over the age of 60, and they have been waiting for PRH units for more than 5 years. And when they asked why from the Department of Health, they don't even get a reply to their letters. And these tenants know nothing about stamp duty of a tenancy agreement. The estate agent will not help them to make sure that the tenancy agreement is stamped. and this is a revenue, a loss of revenue to the government. So how can the government know whether there are subdivided units? The different deputations have referred to different sets of figures, and they are dubious at best, because we don't know how you can gain entry to these units. We find it difficult to gain entry. How can the government do it? So how do you do the estimation? Maybe you can tell us the methodology so that we can have faith in the figures put forth. There's no standard tenancy agreement for the landlord and their tenants, and some tenants have to pay $1.60, $1.70 for every every unit of electricity, but the CLP is only charging their clients $1.10 or something like that. So the THB should look into the waiting time target of 3 years. Maybe for those families on the waiting list which have been waiting for more than 3 years, they should be offered interim housing or allowance because they have to move to a different unit every year, and they have to pay a deposit for new subdivided units, and they have to discard the furniture because they are moving to smaller and smaller units. All these problems can be addressed by the housing department. Ms. Zhang, I live in Kwun Tong. There's a 36. Please switch on the mic of seat number 36. Thank you, Madam Chair. I live in Kwun Tong. It's a tenement building of 50 years. I have 2 kids, and my husband only earns $12,000 a month. I have to pay $8,000 in rent. If we count water and electricity, it's $9,000 a month, and I've been living in a smaller and smaller units. I'm very worried because very easily we'll be asked to leave by the landlord. We would like to have interim housing offered by the government. We will offer some rental units by the government before we get a PRH unit. I applied for PRH in 2012. It's been 5 years now. When I checked, in front of me there are 70,000 applicants, so I don't know how much longer, how many years I have to wait before I really get a PRH unit. We are asking for a 4-person PRH units. I don't care if it's an old unit. We would like to get one as soon as possible, because that would be the best for my kids.
唔好意思，請你。
Well, Mr. Wong, please, we would like to conduct this meeting as smoothly as possible. I now ask government officials to reply. Mr. Ying, please. Please sit down. Please sit down. Yes, please reply. Thank you for comments from deputations and individuals. Well, we are all very concerned about the subdivided flat. Secretary for Transport and Housing is also very concerned about this. I regret to say that he is otherwise engaged. However, I will report everything said in this meeting to him. The issue of subdivided flats and issues related to it have been thoroughly discussed. In 2012, the Long-Term Housing Steering Committee was set up. Strategies have been thoroughly discussed and a number of measures have been put in place. Issues including rent control, rent subsidy, they have all been covered in previous discussions. When it comes to long-term housing strategy, I'm sure you're very familiar with it. Let me briefly explain what we see on a macro level in relation to this issue. For those who are involved in housing work, we fully understand what the focus is. We understand that subdivided flat is not an ideal living environment. We would like to help those living in subdivided flats as soon as possible. Some people may think that the strategies of the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee may not help with the problem. Well, there are about 80,000 households living in subdivided flats. There are two groups. One that are not eligible for housing, for income and asset requirements for public housing. The other group are those that are eligible. Let me give you some information. Less than half of those living in subdivided flats are in the waiting the application queue of PRH units. There are some that have not lived in Hong Kong for 7 years, so they have to wait till they have been living here for 7 years. For those who meet the residence requirement, on average, they wait for 4.6 years for the first allocation of PRH unit. That means some people will wait for more than 4.6 years, whereas others will wait for less than 4.6 years. For those who are waiting for more than the average time, mostly because they are of a bigger household size, we have 1 to 2 persons, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. And if it's a large family, we have to wait for older estates. It would take longer. There are some people who would like to live in the urban area or extended urban area. Supply is limited, so people who are waiting for this will have to wait longer. People who are living in subdivided flats, those who are eligible for PRH, for public housing, of course, the best solution is for flat allocation. Back in 2013, and those that we have interviewed in 2013 and 2014, they will be waiting for about 4.6 years before we give them the first allocation. We'll continue our work with new production, and I think the crux of the problem is land supply. The Housing Authority has put some other measures in place. For existing tenants, they may have other requests, say for example overcrowded households. In the past few months, the HA has reviewed a number of policies, say for example overcrowding policies and well-off tenant policies. We would like to put resources in best places to meet different demand. Very often in Housing Authority discussions, we talk about giving resources to accord priority to those living in subdivided flats. And I think I have to make it clear on a number of points raised by deputations and individuals. First, whether there is any abuse of public housing resources. It's our ongoing work. We will take enforcement actions. We will look at the usage of utilities, to gather evidence to ask tenants to vacate their public housing. If you encounter such cases, please let us know. Idle resources. The Housing Division doesn't have the information. We'll liaise with the Development Bureau. We know that the Development Bureau has been working very hard to identify land. Some other people mentioned about vacant school premises. In May this year, the Planning Department has announced a list of vacant school premises and the prepared use. 18 sites will be used for public housing. Some of them we have almost completed. If we know of any idle land, I myself will actually go to the Development Bureau to talk to them, and if there are no other uses, I'll ask that to be used for public housing. That's all for now. We're supposed to finish at 5:10. I'll extend it to 5:15. The next session will start at 5:20. We will extend the time of the entire meeting. There are 7 members who would like to speak. We'll try to cover as many members as possible. Those who don't get a chance to speak will continue in the next session. There are 3 motions, 2 from Mr. Chuk Yuen and 1 from Mr. Leung Yiu Chung, but we are still 1 member short. If I wait till 7 o'clock to deal with the motions, there will not be enough quorum. So I now appeal to members, if you are free, please come to this meeting so that we can deal with the 3 motions as soon as possible instead of waiting for the next session. We only need 1 more members. First, I ask members to speak. I would like to give sufficient time to members, so if you don't get a chance in this session, you will in the next session. We have Michael Lok, Andrew Wan, Wilson or Lau Siu Lai. First, Mr. Michael Lok. Thank you. I thank deputations and individuals for coming to talk to us and to speak for those who experience difficulties with housing. A number of years ago, I have participated in an action for street sleepers asking for resumption of home ownership flats. Well, over the years, we see that the problem deteriorating. We have resumption of home ownership scheme, but the problem still remains. We need some short-term measures. In the long run, we need to increase land supply. That's right, but it's the case of a steed starving while the grass grows. Today is the first work day of the new government. I hope, well, of course, good policies should be continued. But calcified mentalities should be discarded. We've been talking about rent subsidy and rent control. When we talk about rent subsidy, they will say that landlords will benefit. The rent will be put up, and you can at the same time implement rent control to ensure that those who are in need will benefit. People talk about utility fees being overcharged. We have electricity bylaws, supply bylaws, saying that if electricity has been sold by individuals, then the supply will be cut, and it will be subdivided flat residents who suffer. What about a fine? It can say that where without authorization sale of electricity and water is against the law, to draw the attention of landlords to this so that they will not break the law. Well, when there is a will, there is a way. And it's also down to whether we will be able to forge a consensus. In this regard, I hope that the administration should not tell us the waiting time that is inflated. They talk about 4.7 years for first allocation. There are also those who have been waiting for 5 to 8 years and still waiting for the first allocation. I hope that they should be honest. Just lay the problem on the table and show us your determination to find land. One of Mr. Xiu's motion is about high vacancy rate of interim housing. At the same time, I hear that you will have to wait for a year for interim housing. So, is it the case that there is a high vacancy rate, or you still have to wait for interim housing? P.S. I'll see if my colleague will have information about waiting time for interim housing. A number of years, the Audit Commission has conducted inquiries. Yes, indeed, there are some vacant units in interim housing. Mr. Andrew Wen and then Mr. Leung Yu Chong, I appeal to members who are in this building. We only need one member to deal with the motions. I don't think I have sufficient time to ask all the questions. I'll keep it short. A number of deputations have spoken. Well, I am not happy because we only have the Transport and Housing Bureau here. A lot of the policies will involve the care and the community care fund, the housing department, the planning department, and also the development bureau. You are unable to answer questions, and it gives us the impression that you're only fobbing us off. Other government departments should make a presence, because it isn't. You can't just ask the THB, the Transport and Housing Bureau, to come and think that suffices. A number of members have talked about rent subsidy, rent control. I want to ask some questions. Well, there are some clearance actions targeting subdivided flats, and there is also a wave of clearance of subdivided flats in industrial buildings. The administration also talk about criminalizing illegal domestic use in industrial buildings. So, residents who are affected by clearance order, if they make application for public housing, their case might be expedited. Previously, you told us that that is the case for residential development, say for example rooftop accommodation, and now it's extended to rooftop housing in industrial buildings. Why can't it be extended to subdivided flats in industrial buildings? 2. Well, interim housing. I always hear that the Shek-Lei interim housing will be demolished soon, and there is a very high vacancy rate. Can you tell us whether Shek-Lei can start taking residents in or not? Pt1 interim housing gives us an appalling living environment. For Shek-Lei, it looks all right. Or is it the case that you clean it before we made the visit? Well, how about making Pt1 just like Shek-Lei? Well, if you do that, we won't criticize you anymore. Pt1 interim housing. I remember that issues related to things like a toilet have been raised, and there has been some improvement measures put in place. Pt1 and Shek-Lei are old interim housing built to a lower standard. That was all right in the past. However, I'm aware that we need to improve on a number of areas, say for example safety and hygiene. We've made arrangements to conduct a site visit. Was that the standard you adopt for Pt1? Because, well, we were not too worried after the inspection. We saw that a lot of the units have been refurbished. So do you use the same standard when you allocate interim housing to those in need? I think you visited the transit center, not interim housing. There are two types. Well, for interim housing, what you saw was what we had. We deal with the motions first. One from Mr. Leung Yiu Chung. It's very simple. That is, the administration should conduct comprehensive review on the landlords and tenants comprehensive ordinance and conduct a public consultation. Those in favor, please raise their hands. Those against, please raise their hands. Those who abstain. This is endorsed. Next is one from Mr. Siu Ka-chun. It's a bit long. I apologize. In the past, the administration will conduct clearance actions against subdivided flats that are against the law. Well, those who are displaced will be arranged to go into Pt1 reception center. However, they can only stay there for they have to prove to them that they will not have a place to move into before they can go into interim housing. A lot of people who have lived in the Pt1 reception center criticize that the enforcement action has caused them to lose their home, and there was no need in the first place for them to live in the reception center. And the living environment in Pt1 is appalling and is inhabitable. On the other hand, the administration has not properly used resources of interim housing. Well, say for example, for Kwai Chung and Shek Lei interim housing, there are 1,900 units with a vacancy rate of over 70%. We asked the administration to review its policy and to make arrangements for those who are affected. Those in favor, please raise their hands. Those again, please raise their hands. Those abstain. This motion is endorsed. Next, Mr. Shiu. Well, the government department has not followed up on the issues of overcharging of utility tariffs. In the past, the Environment Bureau, the THB, the Development Bureau, Water Supplies Department, and Race Evaluation Department have been passing the bucks. And the AMSD said that it is possible to install individual and independent meters. So we asked the administration to set up an interdepartmental group to deal with the overcharging of utilities.
Overcharging of utility tariffs. So, Mr. Shiu, do you agree with the wording proposed by Mr. Leung? So it's about overcharging of power and water charges. So, would those in favor please raise their hands?
Okay, 反對嘅淨係
Those against, please raise their hands. Abstentions? Okay, the motion is carried. Okay, so Permanent Secretary, please go back and consider the motions. Okay, I'll invite Mr. Leung to speak, and then we'll end this session. Mr. Leung? Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm grateful to the deputations for coming. And according to one of the speakers, I kind of feel the same. Well, he said that even if making such remarks might not be very useful, he would still insist on making those remarks, and he's not sure whether officials would be listening. Well, apparently for many years the administration seemed to have done nothing about it, so he has repeatedly asked the same question, and I think it's a very good point. Well, just now, Mr. Stanley Ying, the Permanent Secretary, when he made those responses, I was wondering whether or not the administration had listened to us at all, because he said that, well, for vacant school premises, he said that he would take it up with the relevant bureaus and department to see if those sites could be made use of. Well, apparently, it's the first time that he had listened or heard such comments. But then we've been making those requests for years. So apparently he has only assumed his post for a couple of days. He's even newer in his post than the incumbent bureau director. So apparently he said that he would take it up with the relevant department to see if those sites could be made available for housing development. So I find this most regrettable. Okay, Mr. Stanley Ying is trying to respond, so please allow him to speak. Yes, I'll be very brief because I don't want to take up too much of your time. Well, I said that in May, the planning department already explained to you as to the vacant premises on the list and what they've been put to use. Well, out of those vacant school premises, 10 would be made available for public housing development, and we're working on that, and for others we are still studying. So it's not the first time that I've seen it. In fact, we've already explained that there is a list, and we've also explained how those sites would be made use of. I still find it most regrettable. All right, the administration gave us a list out of the 200 plus sites, but then for how many years have we made that suggestion? And yet the administration chose to come to us in such a late timing. All right, it's already at the sunset time of C.Y. Leung's administration. So was it still useful to make those remarks? And still, we insist on making those remarks, and I've moved this motion on tenancy control. I don't know if the administration would be prepared to listen to our voices, because during the last term of government, C.Y. Leung repeatedly said that there shouldn't be any tenancy control because that would be detrimental to the interests of the tenants. But in fact, we have already done that twice. And on both occasions, we felt that it would be useful before we introduced it. So once again, I'd like to ask the Permanent Secretary, will you consider introducing tenancy control again? Permanent Secretary, well, I briefly touch on that. I think we all know that under the LTHS discussion in 2012, there were some who suggested the same, and we understand that there were two camps of views, those who were in favor and those who were against. And then in July 2012, we reported our findings to the panel. We said that in our society, there were those in favor and those who were against, and what their views were. And we also made reference to examples elsewhere and the outcome of such policies. And then in our conclusion in 2012, we said that, well, with tenancy control introduced, well, that was in the report of the LTHS, we said that that would not be helpful to the tenants. In fact, there might be detrimental consequences. In fact, these tenants might not be helped at all. That's why this is not the best solution to the problem. So will you be prepared to consider this again with the new term of government coming or taking up is that with the new term of government coming in? Well, can you tell the incumbent bureau director we have passed this motion, so can you invite him to consider this in his term, whether or not tenancy control should be introduced again? In fact, we are all very concerned about this. In particular, where the motion is carried, I'll definitely take it up with him after I go back. Okay, so we'll take a break and then we'll come back in 5 minutes. Thank you.